Ford in Europe. Well, my friends, the facts say they are basically screwed. Why? They've announced they're firing 4,000 people. You might have already heard that, right? Are you aware of the fact that Ford has lost 50% of their sales in Europe? 50% over the past 10 years. Unfortunately, there's 5 good reasons why Ford made some colossally bad decisions in Europe and why they're likely to go the way of exiting Europe and having to basically fight and scratch for the Chinese car market. And if it doesn't do well in China, which it currently isn't, it's also being killed in China, then it's going to have to do what I've said it will do. And I've said this numerous times now. Focus only on one market, primarily. That is the United States. But then, of course, having all your eggs in one basket, that could be very dangerous. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the channel. I'm the Electric Viking. Great to see you. Ford announced it will cut 3,800 jobs in Europe over the next 3 years as it tries to pivot to being a more electric-focused brand. But see, part of this pivot is what Ford has just done, which is to get Volkswagen to make their EVs for them. It's pretty much doing that, right? It's using Volkswagen's MEB platform. Now, Volkswagen does not make profit on their EVs. We already know that. So how exactly does Ford plan on using Volkswagen's strategy to make profit from EVs? In the United States, Ford loses $20,000 US. That's what they said on each electric car they sell. Currently $20,000 US. Now, I don't see how using a heavy old MEB platform, it's relatively old. They need a new version. They need the Trinity project. That's what the former CEO of Volkswagen said until he was fired. He wanted Volkswagen to pivot to EVs more, to make a new EV focused platform that was lighter, more efficient and cheaper to build. And they fired him. And then Ford went and said, hey, Volkswagen, awesome. We don't have the capacity to make EVs in Europe, so can you do it for us? We'll use your platform. Now, the reality is the Ford Escape, right? It's basically Ford's version of the ID4. It's way better than the ID4, which is crazy, but it's still expensive to manufacture. I don't see how this strategy is going to work for Ford personally. So Ford says that job cuts were designed to help sales in a highly competitive region facing significant economic and geopolitical headwinds. In a note, the company said its strategy to offer an all-electric fleet in Europe by 2035 remains unchanged, with production of Ford's European-built passenger electric vehicle scheduled to start later this year. Now, that's really not a surprise to say Ford's going to be EV only by 2035 in Europe, because that's all you're legally allowed to sell. That or vehicles that can run on synthetic fuels, which is a joke, obviously. Now, here's what Ford said. We are completely reinventing the Ford brand in Europe. Unapologetically American, outstanding design and connected services will differentiate Ford and delight our customers. Now, okay, will their cars delight customers? Well, I don't know, they could, but the key question here is how exactly is Ford going to make a profit? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, Europe has no barriers to entry for China. For Chinese car makers to come in and sell their EVs. They're doing that now. Now we know now, we've seen the numbers, it costs the Chinese around $12,000 US less per car to manufacture a car. $12,000 US less. That's a big advantage, especially when there are no IRA incentives in Europe to make your EVs in Europe. So basically the Chinese can just send their cars, as many as they want, to Europe, which they are now. Why would they not? Because they're losing billions in China. The competition is so fierce in China. The prices of EVs in China are about 35% lower than in Europe. So that's what Ford has to contend with in Europe. But then they also have to contend with Tesla. You might be thinking, whatever, but I can tell you that will be difficult. When Tesla bring out the Model 2 or the Model A, the $25,000 affordable electric car in Europe, which they inevitably will at some point before 2030, and considering they're currently ramping their production at their factory in Berlin to the point where they have the best-selling car in Europe, EV or not, this year so far, and they're eating into market share from other companies such as Volkswagen in Europe this year, not losing it, eating into it. Well, if you think about this, right, it's going to be very hard for Ford to compete with Tesla in Europe and China in Europe, especially considering They don't have that much of a strategy to begin with. Now, experts say that they're not sure electric vehicles can stop Ford Europe's tailspin. Lots of them do. I'm not going to bore you with who they are, but there's plenty of people, experts in Europe and outside of Europe, saying, Ford, sorry, but it doesn't look like you'll exist in Europe anymore. So what happened? How did we get to this place? Like, what happened to Ford in Europe? Ford was once the best-selling car brand in Europe. It was dominating the United Kingdom car market. That's the biggest car market in Europe. So what changed? Well, Ford's business in Europe has been hurt by a poor product lineup, slow electrification, weak brand presence, too few mobility offerings, and an obsession, and I mean an obsession, with cost cutting. The cost cutting, the idea here from Ford is to change its business so it can actually make money. The automaker dropped the Ford Focus compact car, which was once the best-selling car in Europe, and the Fiesta small hatchback, which was the best-selling car in Europe for several years, as it moves to smaller all-electric passenger cars. Now, Jim Farley says that he's trying to fix the many problems in Europe that were caused by bad decisions before he was promoted to become CEO. That's convenient. Now, here are some of the 5 reasons that Ford stuffed up in Europe and why they're finished for Europe, in my opinion. Do you agree with that? Let me know in the comments. For years, Ford lived off its smart decision to move into the van segment in Europe with the S-Max and the Galaxy. In 2007, the Cougar compact SUV, perfectly tailored to European tastes, was launched. But after that, the product pipeline thinned out and became very weak. Ford just started killing off models, basically, left, right, and center. The V-Max small minivan, launched in 2012, arrived just as the segment was declining. The India-built EcoSport small crossover, which was a terrible vehicle in my opinion, launched in Europe in 2014. It made little impact in its segment. Basically, reviewers reviewed it and said, no, it's not very good, don't buy it. The Kia Mini car was replaced by the Car Plus, the low-cost model built in Brazil. But it didn't convince many buyers because it was hard to get the thing up a hill. You had to basically put your feet outside the car and sort of run while you were driving up a hill. Not really, but yeah, it had not enough power for just normal day-to-day operations. The new model seemed like a stopgap, says Autocar, and failed to match the driving dynamics offered by the Focus and the Fiesta. Driving fun was replaced by complete randomness. In 2018, then CEO Jim Hackett, who had previously run an office furniture maker in the United States, decided to phase out less profitable models, especially in Europe, and replace them with nothing. Seriously. The EcoSport and the E-Max disappeared, as did the S-Max and the Galaxy. Ford withdrew from several segments in a short period of time. The company tried to cover up the gap with a flood of facelifts for the surviving models. That didn't work either. So the inevitable happened. Ford's market share began to shrink. From 11.8% in 1994, the share plummeted to 8.2% by 2007, and by 2021 it had dropped to 4.8%. It's now at under 4%. That means Ford's market share in Europe has dropped by 200% over the past 15 years. Saving money became an end in itself, similar to GM's strategy in Europe, and was partly the reason why they almost existence there. As a listed US company, Ford is strongly focused on positive quarterly results. Investors prefer rises in earnings rather than a promising long-term strategy that does not bear immediate fruit. It's one of the key reasons why companies have struggled to electrify and still haven't. I mean, there's really no one other than, say, BYD, who's a mainstream automaker, who has more than 15% of the cars they produce, which are currently electric. Mercedes is moving in that direction, but no one else is anywhere even close to that 15% number. Now, this environment shapes the decisions of all Ford CEOs. Ford's quarterly earnings and presentations to analysts and investors promote the idea that cutting costs and cutting jobs are signs of smart management. That's true. But automotive product cycles last several years, and tools and models are written off over many years. And it is particularly fatal to part with engineers who have accompanied the development history of entire components in times of scarce skilled labor. Now, Ford has made the same decisions in the United States. It recently fired thousands of engineers. Now, maybe Ford would say, well, they work on internal combustion engines, so they're irrelevant to our future. And that could be right. But the only thing is, many of these engineers would have skills that would also work on Ford's EVs. Well, that's what I think anyhow. Now, Ford's plan to cut thousands of jobs at its European Development Centre in Cologne could come back to haunt the company. For this reason, battery electric cars need less development effort than combustion engine platforms. But during the industry's shift to software-led electric models, in-house innovation and value creation is needed more than ever. So my question here is, how exactly will Ford stay ahead technologically with fewer and fewer engineers on board? And consider the fact here that Ford also recently ended its artificial intelligence driving efforts in Europe. It invested billions alongside Volkswagen into an AI joint venture to come up with automated driving. And it didn't like the way it was going, so it simply fired all the employees and just got rid of the business completely. Delayed electrification is another challenge. One of the main accusations directed at Ford's decision makers was that they slept through electrification. Well, to be fair, so did almost every other automaker. When the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, Europe's first production full electric car, was unveiled at the 2009 Geneva Auto Show, Ford executives were among the industry's figures who made fun of the vehicle. They did. In fact, they didn't just make fun of that vehicle, they made fun of Tesla as well. Ford believed it could meet tougher European emissions regulations simply by increasing the efficiency of its combustion engines, and it spent billions trying to do so, and cautiously adopting hybrid technology as well. Now, it held on this view while rivals started to launch EVs. And Ford's advanced development department had already presented capable concepts for battery electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, but Ford simply swept them to the side and ignored them. Here too, the cost-cutting instincts of Ford's bosses had a negative effect. To improve the bottom line in the short term, work on new technologies was scaled back, postponed, or abandoned. To catch up, Ford in 2020 signed an industrial partnership with Volkswagen to use Volkswagen's MEB electric architecture to underpin new Ford all-electric cars in Europe. The first model, a compact crossover based on the Volkswagen ID.4, will go into production at Ford's Cologne factory in the autumn of this year. It replaces the Fiesta built at the plant. A second model will follow next year. The planned volume is substantial, around 600,000 units per year over the next 4 years. But like I said, this will not be a cheap vehicle to make. It takes Volkswagen 30 hours to build EVs using this exact platform. It takes Tesla 10 hours to build EVs using their platform. I don't see this really playing out well for Ford. Although Ford is working on its own electric platform, it will not be available until 2025 at the absolute earliest. It is also not being developed in Europe, but in the United States. Now, another thing Ford is contending with right now in Europe is a weak brand presence. Ford has not managed to position the brand in Europe in a really distinctive way, say experts. Auto News in Europe says that the Ford name is not competitive in Europe. Plus, it's perceived as more of a minus. This has led to the automaker taking part in heavy discounting. Its emergency measure of putting its first EVs on the road with Volkswagen technology will not help it improve its brand presence. Ford's marketing managers have recognized the problem, and they now see promoting the brand's American heritage as a way to stand out from the monotony of the European volume auto market. Now, whether this repositioning will bring the brand its needed turnaround in perception in Europe is anyone's guess, but I would say it probably won't help very much. Besides, Stellantis' Jeep brand is already firmly established in European minds, and the US champion of an adventurous outdoor lifestyle. Ford doesn't have a whole lot new to bring to the table there. Now, the final problem is Ford's mobility strategy, which I mentioned earlier. Ford has a dedicated, loyal, and comprehensive dealership network in many European countries. That's a huge plus in an industry that is seeing a proliferation of brands and multi-brand dealerships. That said, Ford has never encouraged the strong dealer network to really embrace the new world of mobility offerings. Now, it is true that Ford car sharing was introduced in 2013, but it didn't take off. It was used by most dealerships to provide cars to customers while their own vehicles were being serviced or repaired. Unfortunately, that happened all too much. Servicing and repairs is probably Ford's biggest problem in Europe. In fact, it's Ford's biggest problem worldwide. It spends more money on recalls and warranty than any other company in the world and has actually won that race for 4 straight years in a row. The only reason it hasn't in some years is because Volkswagen was forced to recall almost all of its cars after it was convicted of emissions cheating with the diesel scandal. Now, last year, Ford offered subscriptions as an alternative to owning a car, but it is limited to selected dealerships. Its Spin e-scooter rental was sold last year to the German micromobility operator Tier Mobility. Unlike its rivals, Toyota and Renault, Ford is a long way from systematically developing a mobility offering in Europe. That's not to say Toyota is safe in Europe either. It's not. This may not matter at the moment, but in the age of car as a service, it could come back to haunt Ford in the future when competitors are firmly established in this growing business area. I think there's some pretty compelling reasons here for why Ford's slide in Europe is terminal, and the sooner they pull out, in my view, the better. Now, I think they should just do what GM did and cut their losses. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and thank you for watching.